Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, Making Public Histories, Why Republics Die. I'm Peter McPhee. I'm the chair of the History Council of Victoria, and I want to welcome everybody to what should be a fascinating series of presentations and discussion. I'm speaking to you from Abbotsford in Melbourne on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this part of our country, and indeed the traditional custodians of all the lands on which our participants are speaking from. Making Public Histories is a seminar series offered jointly by the Monash University History Program, the History Council of Victoria, and the Old Treasury Building. Each event aims to explore issues and approaches in making public histories. The seminars are open to anyone interested in the creation and impact of history in our contemporary society. And I'm very pleased that you've all joined us this evening on a really important topic. I should say that it's also part of the offerings of the Rare Book Week of the State Library of Victoria. So let me say something about this evening's session and our three presenters. The first, and I'm delighted that we have such a wonderful spread of expertise that's going to be coming our way this evening. All three of our presenters are from the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne. And the first of them is Professor Frederik Vervaet, who's a Professor of Ancient History at the University of Melbourne. A book that Frederik was involved in editing with some colleagues last year was one of the prompts for this evening's session, where he and a number of his colleagues, ancient historians, discussed how they might explain the decline of the Roman Republic in classical antiquity. But part of their purpose in putting together that book was also to encourage other historians to reflect on why republics and democracies have failed at other times in history. Obviously, one of the critical issues of our times, and one that we're going to be discussing tonight, is what appears to many of us to be the surge or the rise of anti-republican or anti-democratic movements and governments around the world. But to begin with, let's hear from Frederik talking about reform unwillingness and the death of the Roman Republic. Over to you, Frederik.
All right. So in 1966, Christian Mayer, German ancient historian, famously defined the final crisis of the Roman Republic in the age of Caesar as a crisis without alternative. He argued that the institutions that had served Rome well as a city-state were no longer fit for purpose for a large empire, and that the retrograde Roman elite simply lacked the imagination to adjust the Roman body politic to the changed geopolitical circumstances. Resultantly, the innately conservative Roman aristocracy doggedly held on to obsolete forms to their own detriment and that of their beloved republic. A few examples, however, should suffice to bust this influential myth. Between 367 and 287 BCE, the Senate and the popular assemblies carried a wide range of reforms concerning substantial debt relief, capping the amount of private and public land held in possession by individual citizens, limited to about 350 acres, and guaranteed plebeian access to high office, thus far monopolized by the patrician minority. This created a more level playing field and ended the conflict of the orders that had plagued the Republic since its creation around 500 BCE. Significantly, these reforms resulted from peaceful plebeian strikes and timely leadership on the part of moderate patrician and plebeian leaders. In 133-122 BCE, the tribunes of the plebs Tiberius and Gaius Sempronius Gracchus famously embarked on a major land reform program, generously capping the amount of public land leased by individual Roman citizens and redistributing the excess to poorer compatriots. So these are some slides documenting the extent of the Gracchus land redistributions, and this is one of those Gracchus land redistribution boundary stones. Since these reforms largely came at the expense of the Latin and Italian allies leasing Roman public lands, Gaius Gracchus also proposed a series of enfranchisement laws granting full citizenship and equal suffrage rights to Rome's Latin allies and equal suffrage rights to the other Italian allies. We can thus rule out pathological reform inability as one of the root causes of the violent implosion of the Roman Republic in the following century. The fate of the Gracchi brothers demonstrates that the problem rather was one of reform aversion, namely the conscious refusal on the part of powerful segments within especially the mighty senatorial elite to embrace reforms counter to their immediate political and financial interests, however pressing the need or justified the cause. In 133 BCE, the incumbent tribune of the plebs Tiberius and 300 of his allies were simply butchered in the streets of Rome. In 122 BCE, in a successful move to undermine Gaius Gracchus's popularity, the conservative consul Gaius Fannius delivered a famous oration before the people on the Italian and the Latin allies against Gracchus, bluntly warning them, quote, that if you give citizen rights to the Latins, have no doubt you would suppose that you will hold your places in popular assemblies or will take part in games and festivals, just as you take your places now. Don't you think that those men will take over all these things? This highly successful harangue of the people paved the way for Gaius's senatorial opponents to resort to deadly violence in January 121, murdering Gaius and about 3,000 of his partisans in brutal street fighting. This begs the question why most of the Roman senatorial aristocracy time and again rallied around what one could term the conservatives of the status quo. First, as major holders of Roman public land across Italy, they doubtlessly felt strongly about possible financial loss, even if the Republic's breathtaking imperial expansion after the Second Punic War had exponentially boosted their fortunes. Arguably far more potent as a driver of Roman elite aversion of redistributive and participatory reforms, however, would have been a deep-seated fear of losing status. Indeed, in her 2022 monograph on how civil wars start and how to stop them, Barbara Walter identifies what she terms the dark consequences of losing status as one of 4 major catalysts of civil war. According to Walter, cohesive social peer groups are likely to resort to violence when facing the prospect of losing status and power in a place they believe is theirs. Political science refers to this phenomenon as downgrading and considers it to be a psychological reality as much as it is a political or demographic fact. And indeed, the Gracchian reforms had sought to sort of strengthen the Roman state, to raise taxes here and there, and to sort of institute some redistributive mechanisms. And this ran counter to the aristocracy's sort of culture of playing the philanthropic culture of playing the grand seigneurs in the Roman Republic. Remains the task now of appraising the social and political cost of the senatorial aristocracy's reform aversion and how this put the Roman Republic on the road to authoritarianism. As Levitsky and Ziblatt argue in their 2018 bestseller How Democracies Die, democracies can only survive if written constitutions are reinforced by 2 basic unwritten norms that are critical in terms of preserving the inbuilt checks and balances: mutual toleration and forbearance. Mutual toleration refers to the idea that as long as our rivals play by constitutional rules, we accept that they have an equal right to exist, compete for power, and govern. A second norm critical to democracy's survival is what we call institutional forbearance, which can be thought of as avoiding actions that, while respecting the letter of the law, obviously violate its spirit. Where norms of forbearance are strong, politicians do not use their institutional prerogatives to the hilt, even if it's technically legal to do so, for such action would imperil the existing system. The opposite of forbearance, Levitsky and Ziblatt go on to explain, is constitutional hardball, a form of institutional combat aimed at permanently defeating one's partisan rivals and not caring whether the democratic game continues. In 133 and 121, the Roman senatorial aristocracy sacrificed both the norms of mutual toleration and forbearance, triggering a well-documented constitutional hardball race to the bottom. Consequently, Roman politics after 121 were marked by escalating polarization and its ugly twin, the rise of factionalism, the ensuing political deadlocks causing interest groups and constituencies on both sides of the divide to lose faith in a traditional political process. As Barbara Walter demonstrates in her analysis of how civil wars start, the rise of factions and the death of hope represent two further powerful catalysts for civil war. Before we appraise the political consequences of the senatorial aristocracy's reform unwillingness, it is useful to consider one further powerful causal factor explaining why the Roman Republic descended into full-fledged civil war in the period following the murders of the Gracchi. Its political system could perhaps be defined as a partial democracy, a competitive aristocratic oligarchy with democratic processes systematically skewed towards wealthy and rural voters. From the age of the Graccans in particular, however, a vigorous reformist minority within the Roman senatorial aristocracy pushed for a more redistributive and participatory fiscal and political system. In doing so, they pushed the Roman Republic even further into anocratic territory, to use another useful political science concept. Anocracies are political systems which are neither fully democratic nor fully autocratic, but combine elements from both extremes. The classical Roman Republic arguably was a textbook anocracy. Significantly, anocracies are considered as inherently at risk of social conflict and civil war. Indeed, Barbara Walter cogently argues that states experience their highest risk of civil war when they are transitioning away or towards democracy. Since the late Roman Republic arguably was an anocracy undergoing a wobbly shift towards the democratic end of the political spectrum, its descent into destructive civil wars flowing from such circumstantial factors as fear of losing status on the part of elite interest groups, rising factionalism marked by the abandonment of the guardrails of democracy, and the loss of hope also becomes readily understandable on a structural level. The fall of the Roman Republic was not inevitable. Had the Roman elites succeeded in embracing reforms granting moderate if tangible concessions to key interest groups and rendering the Roman Republic a more participatory outfit, they might very well have avoided the spiraling internecine strife that paved the way for autocracy. A firm believer in the supremacy of the senatorial aristocracy and hostile to Gracchus-style politics, Cicero nonetheless had the intellectual honesty to blame his own class for the demise of his beloved republic in a philosophical tract that he wrote on the eve of the final civil war, the one between Pompeius and Caesar that would destroy the republic forever. He says such a constitution, in the first place, offers a high degree a sort of equality, which is a thing free men can hardly do without for any considerable length of time. And secondly, it has stability. For the primary forms already mentioned degenerate easily into the corresponding perverted forms, the king being replaced by a despot, the aristocracy by an oligarchical faction, and the people by a mob and anarchy. But whereas these forms are frequently changed into new ones, this does not usually happen in the case of mixed and evenly balanced constitutions, except through great faults in the leading men. So Cicero was lucid enough to appreciate that the perfectly calibrated Roman Republic checks and balances had been brought down by its elites and not by demanding mobs, so to speak. Now, if the example of the death of the Roman Republic tells us anything, it is indeed the paramount importance of responsible leadership sponsoring inclusive reforms. And just one example comparing the Roman Republic and a modern test case. As you all know, in 1991, South Africa also faced sort of a conundrum. Apartheid had collapsed, and the black majority was no longer willing to put up with white minority rule. Now, faced with a powder keg, Nelson Mandela, leader of the left-wing African National Congress, and on the other hand, Frederik Willem de Klerk, leader of the conservative all-white National Party, eventually agreed on a sort of a deal that would secure a peaceful transition and actually sort of prevented the outbreak of all-out civil war, ethnic cleansing, what have you not, in South Africa. Things are not perfect in South Africa today, but I for one strongly believe that things could have been infinitely worse if these gentlemen at opposing positions in the political spectrum had not come to some sort of agreement. Thank you very much for tuning in, and if you want to know more, The book How Republics Die is actually available through open access on the World Wide Web. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before we move on and hear from our next speaker, just one thing that really struck me in your presentation was that you plainly suggesting that focusing on these sort of structural issues is much more useful than discussions of the personality of people like Augustus in an explanation of what happens.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because you quite deliberately didn't speak specifically about his motivations.
Because ultimately, people like Augustus, they are only possible when the structures have failed.
Okay, I understand. I think that's plainly something that we'll need to come back to. I'm now going to introduce our second speaker, Ángel Alcalde. Ángel is a senior lecturer in history, specialising in 20th century European history, and he's going to be speaking on fascism and the destruction of European democracies in the 1930s. So over to you, Ángel.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for your kind introduction. Well, the question why republics die was indeed of crucial importance for the 1930s and for the interwar period more broadly, for these 2 decades between the First and the Second World Wars, which was a time of revolutions, a time of international crisis, economic turbulence, social unrest, a time of civil wars. Currently, in fact, historians argue that the Second World War already started not in September 1939 as conventionally accepted, but earlier, at least from 1937 from an Asian perspective, and according to some interpretations, even from 1935, 1936, with the fascist invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, or with the Spanish Civil War, 1936, or even earlier. The Second World War can be considered to have commenced in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. So historians have described the interwar period as a 20 years crisis, or even more dramatically as the European Civil War, a concept used by many historians. The interwar era, also in my opinion, was a European Civil War, first of all, because of the lingering effects of the destructive First World War, a massively transformative event, the Great War, in which 4 big empires were destroyed. Most importantly, the Russian Empire ended through a profound revolutionary process. In October 1917, this Russian Revolution brings the Bolsheviks to power, a radical socialist revolutionary group led by Lenin. And communism subsequently came an international force endorsed by the Soviet Union, influencing international politics in the interwar period and the politics of numerous countries for decades. However, it will be too simplistic to see the interwar period, as some historians did in the past, as a simple struggle between communism and anti-communism, or between communism and fascism as a reaction. In fact, the European continent that emerged from the Great War and from the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 was clearly dominated by liberal democracy. This is obvious if we look at the post-war map of Europe. I have an example here from 1923, where, excepting Russia, or later the Soviet Union, what replaced the defeated Central Empires was a set of democratic republics and liberal parliamentarian regimes, most of them republics with no kings, because monarchies were largely identified with authoritarianism at the time, but even kingdoms in Europe, such as the Kingdom of Italy, were democratized after the Great War experience with the adoption of universal male and female suffrage, the right to vote. The Weimar Republic in Germany is the paradigmatic example of such type of new democracy, initially under a social democratic government and with a socialist politician as head of state, Friedrich Ebert. The social democratic government of Germany, of Weimar Germany, even violently stopped the more radical revolutionary attempts of German communists by 1919. So therefore, the map of Europe that we see here in 1920 is one of predominance of liberal democratic systems. However, the story of the interwar period is one of, particularly in the 1930s, of decline of that liberal democratic model. If we look at the same map of Europe at the end of the 1930s, we see that those democratic regimes are now a minority. This map shows the dates of formation of right-wing dictatorships in all these countries, mainly in Eastern and Southern Europe. There are some inaccuracies in this map, but it conveys the situation by the late 1930s, which becomes even worse after the outbreak of the Second World War. If you remember, by June 1940, with the defeat and occupation of France by Nazi Germany and other countries, the entire continent of Europe, with some small exception, fell under authoritarian regimes, fascist-inspired dictatorships. But the important question is why this process occurs even before the beginning of the Second World War, during the 1930s most especially. This decline of liberal democracy, I argue in my new book, is driven by the transnational and global rise of fascism from the early 1920s. By the early 1920s, fascism was already an important threat to democracy. Fascism was, to put it simply, how the far right was called in the interwar period. Fascism represented the extreme radical right. It emerges with that name in post-war Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, here in the photograph. And in origin, as you can see, is a violent paramilitary, anti-socialist, anti-communist movement that from very early 1921 managed to attract the attention of the world due to its violent campaign against the Italian left. But it will be superficial to just understand fascism as an anti-communist movement. More deeply, fascism was an anti-democratic, anti-liberal phenomenon, a continuation of the ideological far-right tradition that had started long before in the counter-revolutionary reaction after the first French Revolution in the late 18th century. So fascism was, in my opinion, the modernization of that long far-right tradition that started against the values of the French Revolution and continues through the 20th century, even to our days, to the present. So it's important to stress that the decline of liberal democracy at the hands of right-wing authoritarians starts in the early 1920s. The first country in taking this course technically is Hungary in 1920, but the most significant factor is the rise of fascism in Italy. In October 1922, the moment of this photograph, Benito Mussolini, after a campaign of political violence and pressure against the Italian liberal regime, is appointed prime minister by the Italian king. This happens in the so-called March on Rome, shown in this photograph. This was an unprecedented event of enormous historical significance because for the first time, an extreme right political movement seized the power of a nation state, becoming the main political force in government, in the government of a modern country. However, it was rather in the next decade, the 1930s, when the decline of liberalism became much more intense. From 1929, as you know, there was an economic context of deep crisis, the Great Depression, which is the breeding ground for authoritarian responses around the world. In fact, Germany is from 1930, when the Nazis, the Nazi party of Hitler, started to obtain good electoral results. So the economic crisis generated a mass following for extremist parties like the Nazi party, but also some communist parties. So let's come back to see this map to observe this 1930s process. 1933 in the center, Hitler's seizure of power after being appointed chancellor in January. But next year, 1934, two Baltic states, Estonia and Latvia, as well as Bulgaria, in Eastern Europe, become right-wing authoritarian regimes. And most importantly, Austria, one of those new republics that had been founded in 1919, in 1934 is transformed into an authoritarian dictatorship by a right-wing Catholic politician, Engelbert Dollfuss. This is an image of the Nazi seizure of power, which has also effects in the rest of Central Europe. And this is an image of Dollfuss once he had turned or was turning Austria into another right-wing authoritarian regime. Dollfuss' government crushes the Austrian socialist opposition. Another milestone of this process comes in 1936, mainly with the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. This conflict in Spain is provoked by a coup d'etat against the Spanish Second Republic, which was a democratic system with a left-wing government. The coup is an insurrection of right-wing military officers supported by far-right groups. The war was eventually won by these rebels, here depicted in this photograph, by 1939. And General Franco, in the center of the photograph, becomes the head of government and the state, a dictator in a totalitarian system. So as we see, many democracies collapsed, including the three republics that I have highlighted: the Weimar Republic in Germany, the Austrian Republic, the Spanish Second Republic. And these outcomes historically have been blamed by historians on the weaknesses of democratic traditions of these various countries, the flaws of their political systems, their economic challenges, or the severity of political crisis faced by each country in the 1930s for reasons like those discussed by Frederik in the previous presentation. This unwillingness to reform by elites, for example. This is very clear in the case of Spain. Although these explanations tend to miss crucial transnational, broader factors and influences. Namely, and I will conclude presenting this argument, the very influence of Italian fascism from the start was crucial for the destruction of European democracies in the 1930s. This decline of liberal systems is a consequence of trends initiated with the seizure of power of Mussolini back in 1922, because this first initial breakdown of a liberal parliamentarian system in Italy had deep consequences for the whole of Europe. Mussolini inspired and motivated far-right movements in many other countries, which imitated the Italians or adapted the fascist model into their own country. In turn, Italian fascists openly aimed to promote dictatorship in the European continent. They did so even with propaganda, as you can see also in this photograph, an example of that European propaganda in favor of dictatorship. Hitler in Germany was basically one of those people inspired by the Italians, was an imitator and admirer of Mussolini, and Mussolini was a mentor for Hitler in his struggle for power. This photographic one is a photograph of their first personal encounter, but even before that they had maintained intense correspondence in which Mussolini advised Hitler about politics, about how to reach power. Also in the case of Austria, Dollfuss, here depicted, received the support and the advice and the influence of Mussolini. So the Austrian Republic turned into a right-wing authoritarian regimes mainly because Mussolini wished so. The anti-republican rebels in Spain, also led by Franco, were able to fight victoriously the war against the Spanish Democratic Republic, thanks to the help of both Hitler and Mussolini. And Mussolini, in fact, sent nearly 70,000 Italian soldiers to help Franco win the war. As in a way, as this Republican propaganda poster suggests, fascist Italy was an invader of Spain. So, to conclude, the destruction of European democratic republics in the 1930s was part of an even broader process, the global rise of fascism, in which first Mussolini's Italy and later also Hitler's Germany were the driving forces. And in the end, fascism not only brought liberal democracies to a deep crisis, but also pushed the world again into a world war. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Ángel, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure has raised all sorts of questions for people. And let me remind people that if they have questions, that they should pose them through the Q&A button on their screen. But let's finally turn our attention to the contemporary world. I'm delighted to introduce to you Julia Bose, who's a lecturer in gender history and whose first book has just appeared, Every Man's Home a Castle, Parental Rights and the Making of Modern Conservatism. But Julia is going to be speaking to us this evening under the heading of Make America Great Again, an historical perspective on the rise and decline of democracy in the United States. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Peter. Wonderful to be here today and to join Frederik and Ángel in this, I think, very important discussion. And the 12-minute challenge for me was really quite hard. I was thinking about where to start this lecture yesterday, and I originally started in 1776, and I spent much of the day in the late 18th and early 19th century before deciding 12 minutes wasn't enough. So what I want to do today is actually focus on a very contemporary kind of period in US history that will be familiar to many of you and give something of a historical perspective on where those kind of forces and trends have come from and how they've collided to create, I guess, the precarity that we're seeing in democratic systems and ideas of the republic there. And so I've chosen to start here with the same point that Frederik did. I noticed that he picked an image that made the Jan 6 riots look very contemporary. I've picked an image that makes it look more historic. And in preparing this, I knew I'd be going third, so I thought I would try and anticipate what some major kind of points of emphasis are. And actually, to some degree, they're kind of different points that I'll be emphasizing here. Although if I had started with 1776, I think the point I was going to make was similar to what Frederik was saying, which is that although the United States is a kind of a modern nation, one of the first modern nations founded on a set of political ideals about self-government and popular sovereignty, right from the beginning of the founding of the US, there's a very heated and contested debate over whether the United States should be a democracy or whether it should be a republic, just how democratic it should be, what sort of checks and balances there should be, how much, I guess, democratic decision-making processes should be removed from the people. And those ideas continue to be contested today. But the forces that I want to focus on that I think are very prevalent in the US now and kind of a more recent and historical contemporary roots of what we see is, I think, a mass distrust in public institutions. And this is something in the second half of the 20th century, so I'll show you on the next slide, continues to basically decline. If you look at what percentage of Americans trust their government to do the right thing, some or all of the time, it's pretty much a steadily declining rate from the mid-20th century. The second, and one of the things driving that distrust, is obviously an era of deep polarization. And there's many factors, again, here that we can look at. I want to look particularly at the role of the media in driving polarization in the US. It's also a political style that enables Donald Trump, and that Donald Trump perhaps bests his predecessors in the Republican Party in terms of that combative grievance style politics, right? And an oppositional force that kind of erodes the ability of Congress to make any sort of meaningful progress. Two things that really collide and I think throw these things into higher gear is obviously the economic instability and the global financial crisis of the 2007 and 2008. Once Trump is elected, and in some senses you can see a longer historical trend of the centralization of presidential power and the rise of executive orders due to, I guess, the locked nature of Congress and the inability of the houses of Parliament in the US to pass legislation. But you obviously start to see the erosion of legal and democratic norms. This rests on obviously the preceding 2 points. You have to have a population that really believes the leader, that believes that the leader is just and acting in this way. And that in some senses depends on some conspiratorial thinking and kind of mass polarization and divisions in terms of the news people are consuming. So another quick way, right, to have a democracy or a republic fall is to have a coup. And I put there, though, a coup with a question mark, right, because this is a real flashpoint in modern US history that really divides the nation to today, because there's two sides to this story. You know, obviously the one which I open with today is when we see 2,000 to 2,500 people enter and storm the US Capitol building on January 6, 2021 to try and stop the legal certification of the election of President Joe Biden. And there's tens of thousands of protesters and rioters that join them outside. This, by many accounts, certainly the accounts of legal authorities in the US, right, is tantamount to a coup d'etat or an attempted coup d'etat. It's an insurrection against the US government. It is a rejection of the result of a democratic election. This is obviously not the first time this has happened in US history. The US Civil War is another obvious example. But it is something that suggests, you know, a deep crisis in democratic legitimacy and a growing movement of people that don't accept the democratic process led by the former and now current president, Donald Trump. But of course, if you look at what's driving January 6th and the rioters that storm the Capitol building and try to quote unquote stop the steal, is a widespread belief amongst many Americans. We can just say that 28% of Americans believe that the 2020 election was stolen. And that is particularly stark down partisan lines. So 50% of Republicans believe the election was stolen and only 9% of Democrats. And if you look at that in terms of people who self-identify as MAGA supporters, Make America Great Again supporters, they are twice as likely as non-MAGA Republicans to think the election was rigged. This is not kind of an ephemeral moment in US politics in the heat of the election with Trump voting it up. It's a belief that's actually growing. So in 2025, the Washington Post and University of Maryland found that 62% of Americans, adult Americans, believed that Biden's win was legitimate, and that was down from 69% in the same poll in December 2020. If we look here at the roots of this slide in public trust in government, it's got two things that I want to point to here. One of which is, as I gestured to on the last slide, that public trust in the US federal government has steadily dropped from about 77%, which was an all-time high in 1964, to historic lows in recent years around the 20% mark. This is driven by political politicization. It's also driven by national crises and institutional scandals. So Catherine Olmsted, who's written a wonderful history of Conspiracy in 20th century US political thought makes the point that one of the reasons the US population is so distrustful of its government is often because of what the government has done covertly, massive scandals like the Vietnam War, Watergate, the Clinton impeachment scandal, the Iran-Contra affair. And so this belief in conspiracy about the government certainly predates Trump and the conspiracies about the Biden 2020 election win. For example, she opens her book by citing that 36% of Americans thought that the Bush administration either planned 9/11 or knew that it was coming and did nothing. So a second kind of major trend driving this is the growth of wealth inequality in the United States, or the resurgence, I would say, from kind of a high point here in the period that Ángel was talking about, in the interwar period right before the Great Depression. And there's many, obviously, factors driving this, but it really kind of pulls apart what is known as kind of the age of compression in the mid-20th century, when trust in government is high, wealth is growing for all Americans across the board, and the gap between rich and poor is much, much closer together than it is today. So where I want to spring off here from today is look at the global financial crisis as a real accelerant that kind of explodes these politics that start to question the mainstream political establishment, unleashing forces of economic populism on both the left and the right. So the global financial crisis, which in Australia is conveniently called the GFC, they don't have actually a short term for it in the US, is obviously an economic shock that causes downward mobility across all racial groups. And I think here this really ties in with what Frederik was saying from Barbara Walter's work about a sense of downgrading. So what you see is across basically almost all of the US population is downward mobility. So in the 90s, you see a hemorrhaging of manufacturing jobs, particularly with NAFTA and offshoring to China. And further 2 million jobs are lost in the immediate aftermath of the GFC. For those that find work again, the majority of them find work that pays less than it did before. And this is disproportionately felt by Black Americans and non-white Americans across the board, who are more vulnerable to subprime mortgages. And I'm not going to go into this as much today, but that really drives the Black Lives Matter movement, which in some senses undermines what Clinton and her husband previously had relied on as stalwart support for the Democratic Party. What's kind of significant here is, unlike the early 1990s, where the rise of globalization threatened blue-collar jobs, the global financial crisis in the early 21st century really affects all swathes of the economy. So it does affect the working class, but also recent college grads and the middle class, who are all economically vulnerable. This is coming off the tech boom of the late 1990s and early 2000s, which has kind of sold the gig economy as this model that will allow for entrepreneurship, for self-employment, for a lot of mobility and movement around the market. And what it does is make a unique number of Americans and people across the world vulnerable to the economic shocks of the global financial crisis. And of course, the other major point here is that what Americans see when both Bush and Obama bail out the banks is, which may be necessary to cut the kind of losses and the bleeding in the economy generally, is that the stock market rebounds very, very quickly. So while the economic pain of the global financial crisis is prolonged for most Americans, it leads to a downward mobility in terms of real or perceived, in terms of their economic quality of life. The stock market has remade all of its gains by 2012 and then hits unprecedented levels. So this leads to two kind of explosions of social movements in the early 21st century that at the time seem either fringe or a little bit ephemeral. And I think with now the benefit of a longer durée of history, we can see that these are actually really shaping the present political moment in ways that laid the path, obviously, for Bernie Sanders on the left and also Donald Trump on the right. So Occupy Wall Street is a movement led by kind of an interracial group of particularly young Americans, especially college graduates who are graduating at the end of the global financial crisis and finding an economy that's where opportunities are vanishing. And the occupation of Zuccotti Park only lasts for 2 months. There's obviously occupations that therefore take place all over the world. But the actual movement itself doesn't produce, a statement or philosophy. It seems at the time to be something that is pointing to a sense of economic despair. It obviously has a very popular slogan about the 99%, pointing to that concentration of wealth in the hands of the 1%. But really, until Bernie Sanders becomes the heir apparent of that movement, it's really not clear the longue durée effect that that's going to have. On the right, we see the Tea Party form in around 2007 to 2009 and have its heyday between that period and 2011, when it exerts the most kind of political influence over the midterms in 2010. And this is a kind of, again, a bit of an inchoate movement that is broadly anti-tax and anti-government, that opposes the coddling of America's rich, so it opposes the bailout, it opposes the economic coddling of the middle class, so in particular taking aim at middle class welfare and well-unionized public sector jobs. But it also, the philosophy is maybe anti-free trade. It's a clear sign that the base or the grassroots of the Republican Party are turning against free trade. But, they obviously want to defend government welfare policies like Medicare, from which they benefit. And what really takes over that movement is also some conspiratorial ethno-racial resentment. So they're really propelled and galvanized by Obamacare and target President Obama. It's the origins of the birther scandal, the kind of conspiratorial belief that Obama was not born in the United States, which will be so central to Trump's rise. All right, the third factor that I just want to point to here today is the role of the media. And there's various aspects that you can look at in the polarization of the media. I think social media plays a big part. There's obviously a parallel story here about what's happening on the left. But the point I want to make is that in the early 1990s, there's a lot of kind of pioneering right-wing journalism that I think creates the Trump base, or speaks to the Trump base, that the Republican Party and conservative media moguls are keen to tap into and to profit off, and then they lose control of the process altogether. So Rush Limbaugh starts his broadcast show in the 1990s. He begins to redirect the direction of the Republican Party as a really influential player towards characters like Newt Gingrich in the 1990s. Obviously, Murdoch and Roger Ailes get together in the mid-1960s and launch Fox News, which immediately is given its fodder through the Clinton impeachment trial. And then has various moments where its ratings will really peak and pick up. So it will not call the election for Gore in the 2004 election. And after 9/11, they start running kind of bizarre conspiracy theories that point to kind of a left-wing mass election conspiracy that won't call like the 9/11 terrorists. But it's Obama's presidency that really, again, vaults Fox ratings, in which Hannity, instead of looking at how why conservatives lost the election, he welcomes his viewers that evening to the resistance. After the Tea Party launches, we see that go further to the right and further to the fringe in online media platforms and alternate media platforms. Steve Bannon and Andrew Breitbart found Breitbart News, which is a big part of the Tea Party movement, and obviously Alex Jones as well, until he's finally discredited for his Sandy Hook conspiracy theories, plays an enormous role in founding the Flames, the kind of far-right conspiratorial thinking. So where does this all come together? I think the swamp that Trump identifies is really real, and what we see in the kind of insurgent left with the rise of Bernie Sanders as well as Trump is a complete repudiation of the political center, which has a very cozy relationship with Wall Street. It means from both the left and right, there's a huge rejection of kind of the free trade orthodoxy that's been a central part not only of Republican politics, but Democratic politics as well. So Trump is really the political personification of the New York Post, the tabloid news media in New York City, where he's from. In terms of the types of views that it gives view to, the kind of race-baiting, scandalous, law and order politics, but he's also the tabloid fodder, right? His divorces, his celebrity, the people that he consorts with are the kind of scandalous and salacious news that drives New York Post readers. And that celebrity has always been rooted in an unabashed promotion of racism and misogyny. So there's a long kind of historical precedent to this, which Jonathan Bartho traces to kind of the resistors of integration, racial integration in the American South in the mid-1950s, right? The George Wallace figures who stand in front of the door of the auditorium blocking Black students from integrating universities and schools in the American South in that period. And it's a return to a politics that no longer speaks in dog whistles, but where the quiet part is said out loud. And finally, what Trump's really done, as I've said, is he's really the kind of sensational, conspiratorial, race-baiting, misogynistic news that those kind of party media platforms are pushing allows Trump to kind of pick up that steam and pull both the party and those right-wing media establishments to test how far they'll go in their own commitment to democratic institutions and norms. So J.D. Vance, as a never Trumper, is a great example of that, as is Rupert Murdoch, who initially is a never Trumper and opposes Trump, but realizes where the money is going and kind of walks back his stance, realizing that he needs Trump as much as Trump needs Fox News. And the positive note on which I'll end is that the Democratic Party is similarly embroiled in an internal struggle to how to channel Trump's success in reaching an economic populist kind of base without necessarily the baggage. So the recent scandal over Graham Plattner, who was meant to be kind of the great white hope for the party in unseating Susan Collins in Maine and winning back the Senate, right? There was obviously signs from the beginning that his own troubled relationship with women, potentially some baggage around his racial politics, and the Democratic Party kind of held on right until rape allegations started to surface, which was where they drew the line. So I'll leave it there for today. Look forward to your questions.
That was totally fascinating. Thank you so much, Julia. And while people are thinking of questions to ask our three panelists, let me begin with one that's directed at all of you, but you could perhaps begin the responses. Julia, this is from Deb Hull, who says that the process that Ángel spoke about, where other countries were inspired by those that had become totalitarian and were supported by those countries to follow the same path, does the panel see parallels today? Perhaps you could begin the answer, Julia.
Yes, certainly. There's actually I'm trying to think of the name. There's recently been a book that's about how much American conservatives have coveted strongmen and authoritarian leaders elsewhere, which is like a prehistory of Trump. I think that there's actually common, again, economic forces driving that. I think what I didn't really talk about today is the role immigration has played in opening up this kind of anti-immigrant far-right politics. So I think that's a commonality. Trump himself, I almost try to avoid speaking about him in public because I do think he's an anomaly. He obviously loves Kim Jong-un. He's got his relationship with Putin. But I wouldn't say he ever studies a style. Like, he might be influenced, but it's kind of like an innate instinct for him.
Do either Ángel or Frederik want to comment? Yes?
Yeah, I definitely, I also see very clearly the same processes of intentional influence over other countries, but also from other countries, other far-right movements looking towards the United States and the model of Trump and imitating, applying the same sort of strategies, political strategies, or above all media strategies, and transnational figures like, well, some of the advisors of Trump have been touring European countries to meet with far-right leaders. And of course, we don't know yet what exactly they talk about, but it's very obvious that there's this sort of far-right international, which in recent times historians have been analyzing in the interwar period in the history of fascism. So many parallels, many similarities. We see basically, so to speak, the same happening. Yeah.
The question that I want to put to the three of you is that there seems to be quite a common set of arguments that you're putting about the importance of economic resentment, anxiety about loss of status, hostility to elites, a whole series of broader socioeconomic and cultural trends, rather than focusing on the primary role of an individual in overthrowing republics. I was struck thinking of your paper, Ángel, by the famous book by Elizabeth Viskerman in 1980, Europe of the Dictators, whereas you seem to be saying it's Europe of social and economic collapse first and foremost, and the dictators come afterwards. And I was wondering whether the three of you would agree that really when we're talking about dictators or people who overthrow republics or democracies, that they're actually individuals who, in a sense, know how to become more important once it's happened and develop a particular style. But if you're looking for the origins of the problem, you have to look much more widely at social and economic changes and stresses that are occurring. Would any of you like to comment on that?
Yeah.
Well, I would say, no, go ahead, Ángel.
Well, yes, these underlying structures are clearly there, although I always say that the structures by themselves do not produce outcomes. There are other phenomena going on, which not necessarily or to a very small extent have to do with specific individuals or leaders, although those are also important for the evolution of politics. Something that I rather emphasize is the communicative process. So, and this is even more important these days, over the last 20 years, communication, contact, mutual influence over crossing borders transnationally, all that is a factor itself in the dissemination of political choices, ideas, sets of ideas, ideologies. And above all, I think the perception, transnationally and globally, the perception of political success is extremely important. It was because of the success of the Italian far right of fascism in 1921, 1922, that other political groups that could have just stayed within the conservative right-wing spectrum adopted much more radical ideas and practices. I think we have seen this today or in the last 20 years also, because of the success, of course, of Trump and Trumpism in conquering government power. So those communicative processes are very important, as important as the structural base of the historical context.
Particularly, the cult of the individual seems so important under Augustus.
Yes.
The way he creates that.
Yes, but he does that after he comes to power, of course.
Yes,
and he comes to power in a bloody civil war at the tail end of... the moment Augustus Octavian comes into the picture, the Republic is already dead for all intents and purposes. He just... He ruthlessly finishes it off. But what I see a strong parallel with the present day and era is that the rise of strongmen is often preceded by profound socioeconomic malaise and spiraling inequality. I mean, we live in an era where for example, Mr. Musk, his combined wealth is, I think, worth as much as the annual GDP of Australia. In the late Roman Republic, you had people like Crassus and Pompeius who had individual fortunes that were bigger than those of, for example, the classical cities. The imperial republic that was Athens in the 5th century CE was not as rich as somebody like Crassus or Pompeius. These men were richer than kings within a republic. And this was sort of paired with the relative or real impoverishment of the general citizenry, the citizenry at large.
Okay.
Yeah.
Julia, I've got another question for you from someone who appreciates your take on the interplay between media and politics. Are you able to speak at all about anything inherent to these broadcast technologies, cable television, social media, and their ownership that may lead to exacerbate misogynist and racist sentiment and expression in the populace?
Yes, I mean, there is, if you take that back to the 1980s with the FTC, like Reagan appoints a director of the FTC who's very pro-deregulation and kind of easy antitrust laws to allow kind of more media monopolies to form, which when then cable television is launched in the 80s and 90s kind of paves the way for that. And that's also something that Al Gore, especially as vice president, really keen to encourage the development of the internet in Silicon Valley, probably pushes a more pro-growth position where there was more room for kind of laying the foundations for the regulation of tech industries and social media companies. But at that instance, they're actually more interested in what's very pertinent after September 11, which is getting the surveillance technology that the US government then uses, right, to surveil its citizens. And that's one of the things that Olmsted talks about as one of those examples of where the actions of the US government is one of the things undermining the trust in the US government. In terms of kind of the more misogynistic and racist sentiments, I mean, I think that's part politics, part media playing off one another, but definitely you notice that with Fox, the continual way to up the ante and to increase the base, especially when you start to get these competitors in online media and through YouTube channels, is to be more outrageous and more salacious. And so there is a real abandon. I think Jonathan Barthet makes this point quite well, that you look back at the Reagan era and everything is said in dog whistle, like none of the quiet parts are said out loud, and there's a complete drop of that restraint, and Trump's kind of the greatest example of that. And that, I think, goes back to what Frederik's saying about, in some senses, these unwritten norms that have been completely subverted or abandoned.
A question perhaps for you then, Ángel. Are there historical examples of countries where totalitarian regimes seem to be on the way, but something interrupts it? And if so, what can interrupt it?
Yeah, good question. Thinking about the interwar period, the 1930s, I see this process with a global perspective, and one can see that the fascist Italy and Nazi Germany operated like magnetic centers for these advance towards authoritarianism. So that happens rather homogeneously over the European continent. So other countries that fall under that influence tended to advance towards authoritarianism. However, from other big polities that remained democratic, there was this resistance and this impulse in the opposite direction, maintaining democratic norms, mobilizing people from below, coalitions between left-wing groups and center Republicans, etc. In Latin America, this is perhaps the most interesting case because that influence from Europe of authoritarianism and the fascist model starts to appear in, at least from the early 1930s, quite clearly. So fascist-inspired groups appear in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and there is a slide towards more and more authoritarianism. But from 1936-37, when in the United States, a new president, Roosevelt, comes to power with a clear policy that is progressive and is opposed to fascism, at least in theory, in rhetoric. And also there is a concern by the United States in geopolitical terms that this influence of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany over Latin America is dangerous. There is an intervention, a sort of gradual involvement of the United States in those Latin American countries that ends up removing Nazi and fascist influence by 1939 very clearly. That doesn't mean that the United States is not supporting other forms of authoritarian regimes in the region, as had done historically, but very clearly that presence of the United States there in the continent sort of towards stops that advance of the fascist model in Latin America.
A question for you, Frederik. I mean, one of the common arguments that you about authoritarian rule that you didn't address is whether the Roman Empire has become so large by that time that it is impossible to sustain institutional norms, and that very large imperial powers, I mean, Russia is another example, are very prone to sort of what is strong authoritarian rule. Is that an argument that you would consider?
Not really, because the Romans had already, yes, Rome originally was a city-state with institutions for a city-state, but the Romans had already showed themselves masters at adapting these institutions. At the time of the Gracchi already, they ran a Mediterranean empire successfully as a republic. This could have gone on indefinitely. Mind you, that the Roman Republic, it was a predatory republic to the extent that the provinces, the subject people in the provinces who had no say in the decision-making in Rome and in Italy, essentially paid for the entire imperial adventure, because the burden of taxation shifted from the subjects, the Roman citizens, to the subjects in the provinces.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We're getting lots of wonderful questions. Here's another one for you, Julia, from Susan Bray. Are the actions and strategies of Russia and perhaps China in using misinformation and disinformation influential or simply peripheral to the trends that we're seeing?
I mean, that is a great question. I would say I'm not a scholar of the present, but it's anyone's guess. I mean, you're talking, Peter, earlier about how important the cult of personality is versus the structural forces. I mean, the 2016 election is, for all intents and purposes, could have gone either way. And the degree to which misinformation coming from Russia played a role in that, it's difficult to pass from all the other factors that also played a role in Hillary Clinton's loss in that election. It's something that I think, though, however, no longer, or at least to the same extent, right, is the exclusive province of what Chinese and Russian forces are doing. It's also democratically produced now in terms of the misinformation that spreads around and the conspiracy theories. But yeah, I think that will actually need to be one that future historians will need to judge.
Yes, thank you. An interesting anonymous question here, a big one that all three of you might consider. Are these institutions beyond public rehabilitation? Can public trust be won back? Or are these institutions, these regimes, doomed to collapse and turn to authoritarian measures to fortify themselves? So I guess the question is asking whether the experience of the societies you've been talking about is necessarily unilinear, or are there ways in which they can recover?
Well, if I may, to address that, of course, the history will live forever, a mark, an impact in the trajectory of the countries. So history will not go away. So what is being produced will have consequences. However, that doesn't mean that the countries, the different systems will be stuck in a loop of authoritarianism. They have moved towards that pact. And a very clear historical case is Germany itself, which dramatically changed turn, and not only after 1945, after the destruction of Nazism, but also in the 1920s. It was a big change towards democracy that should be emphasized, coming from a past of an autocracy, basically. So historically, everything is open. We shouldn't be fatalistic, or we can be optimistic to some extent in the possibility of overturning trends that has happened in the past and can happen in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I was thinking a lot while the three of you were speaking about the role of what we today would call the public service, and how crucial it has been in terms of having a professional public service of people whose primary commitment is to the rule of law and to non-partisan implementation of policy, and how crucial an independent public service has been in the stability of democratic and constitutional and republican regimes. And yet we know that the public service can also be very vulnerable, as we've seen in the contemporary United States. But I was thinking, as the three of you were speaking, just what the experience was in all of the countries that you were referring to about a public service, whatever it was described as, of people who had a commitment not to a political party, but to the public good, so to speak. And whether, in fact, they're a source of people who, in the long run, are capable of actually rebuilding a post-authoritarian regime in that society. I mean, it's a crucial point, for example, about after the overthrow of Napoleon, that a more professional bureaucratic public service, they're called bureaucrats for the first time, actually comes to play a crucial role in rebuilding the notion of a non-partisan state apparatus. Would any of you like to comment about that?
Yes. I can see it actually ties into some of the questions that are being asked here. I mean, I do think Graham's asked a question about Obama's presidency, and I think it's an interesting one to look at in terms of both the failures of the presidency itself, but the strength of his campaign. So the positive note that I would say was that was really a campaign that got people excited about democracy. So I think it is possible to run kind of mass campaigns where the emphasis of the campaign was about revitalizing democracy, about getting more people involved, about kind of taking back power. But the question about the public service, I think, Peter, is actually really interesting, because one of the things, I guess it was Musk more so than anyone with the Doge force. What he did so successfully, which has been a trend in US politics for 20 or 30 or 40 years, right, is he undercut the capacity of the public service to the point that the experience of using government or a government service in the United States is so unpleasant that it undermines public trust in the government. So, as a historian of anti-statism, really when I went to get my driver's license there and sat in a New York DMV for 9.5 hours before I got served, right, it gave you a new perspective on kind of those forces that color people's experience and perspectives of government. So I don't know if that's very optimistic, but certainly slashing and burning the public service right that way creates necessarily what Tech Valley people would call a user experience that's deeply unsatisfying, and further fuels that kind of resentment and distrust of public institutions and public services.
Yes. Yeah, interesting. Frederik, here's one for you about the long-lasting impacts of these so-called failed republics. The question is that I often see the argument that they achieve nothing, things just return to how they were before. Would Frederik maybe have some examples of long-lasting effects, maybe some positive reforms that survived?
Well, in terms of the Roman Republic, in terms of the immediate aftermath, so the arrival of strongmen and empire did nothing to ameliorate the conditions of the Roman poor. If anything, inequality under the early empire and then the late empire spiraled. As for the long-term legacy of the Roman Republic, well, we only have to look at the US Republic. The founding fathers were very well versed in the classics. Polybius was very widely read, and copies were actually sort of handed to people involved in the American revolutions. So Polybius is famous sort of précis of the Roman Republic with its checks and balances. So the US Republic was very consciously modeled on the Roman Republic, precisely also because the Roman Republic was a partial democracy. It was not a genuine popular vote republic. That had benefits at the time, perhaps, but we also see, a system like the Roman Republic, and the same is, in my view, true for the US Republic, it only works when there is bipartisan consent about certain core issues. When bipartisan divisions grow and you have like hyperpolarization and super factions, you get stalemates, you get ceaseless filibustering, which also existed in the Roman Republic, and ultimately the whole machinery grinds to a halt.
Yes.
So the flaws of the Roman Republic are also inbuilt in the US Republic, so to speak.
Now, here's a tough one for Ángel and Julia from Aliyah Beecher. How should we distinguish between a republic experiencing severe political dysfunction and one that is genuinely transitioning towards authoritarianism? What common characteristics do republics have that enable them to survive rather than collapsing?
Well, I can give a historian's answer. It would depend always on the historical process itself, I would say. It is extremely difficult to determine whether a country, a republic, is going to just go through dysfunction and then recover, or collapse into an authoritarian system. That will always depend on imponderable factors that may not depend from the country itself. It can be an external influence, events that happen in another country that influence a given system. But thinking about the past, and some sociologists and historians in the past have tried to answer the same question in the interwar period. What characteristics made some countries retain their democratic republic while others fell into authoritarianism? A historian and sociologist called Louis, he argued that it was, in Europe, the importance of the previous liberal traditions in each country that determined to a great extent the outcomes of the crisis. So countries with a strong liberal tradition from the 19th century, that countries that many decades before already had developed parliamentarian institutions and a political culture that it was appropriate for that system, were more able to withstand this pressure of authoritarianism. And sometimes for countries that had not had this tradition, there were still possibilities to retain models of democracy, even social democracies, depending on the political alliances that were established between social groups or parties. But yeah, certain countries that lacked that liberal tradition from the past and that established alliances in politics that polarized social groups, mainly the bourgeoisie against the working class, that ended very badly in fascist dictatorships. So things are always quite open depending on historical traditions and historical events that can come and change the situation.
So are you optimistic, Julia?
I mean, yeah, the optimistic take, right, is that the US has been severely politically dysfunctional from its start, and that many of the trends that we see today, right, like the deprivation of rights, deportations of migrants, cracking down the rights of citizens, these all have precedent in American history. And there's been moments, the early republic might have not been quite as shaky, but there was genuine debate, right, about how democratic the US would be. Brendan McConville, in his book, the Three Kings Faces makes the point that none of the founding fathers, right, had a son, that potentially in that early stages when the Republic was being established, if there had been an heir to one of the founding fathers, the culture of Republican government might not have taken root in quite the same way. We've obviously got lots of dynasties in American politics now, but at the time they didn't. The US Civil War, right, is another obvious example of where the experiment nearly completely unraveled and did come back. And so the positive way to put on that, right, is that a lot of commitment to democracy and rights has not been always viewed by the elites or certain groups in American society as being the purview of everyone. And there's actually a very strong tradition in US history of contesting that, of strengthening US democracy, of expanding US democracy, of expanding who's included. So I don't know exactly where it will go, but I'm sure it will certainly be fiercely contested by people that oppose, a closing of democratic processes and a return, want to see a return to kind of the norms and the safeguards that have actually led that experiment to endure for 250 years.
Thank you very much. And there's one final comment here, and before we wrap up, which comes from Anthony McLeod from the ACT. A big thanks for all the talks. Frederik mentioned one of the 4 conditions of a civil war, downgrading. What were the other 3? Frederik's presentation on the Roman Republic I found very interesting, with much new to me, and I've downloaded the book he mentioned. But thanks very much to the History Council, much appreciated. Do you want to comment on that, Frederik?
All right. Well, thank you very much for your interest. I mean, from memory, the 4 catalysts for civil war, according to Barbara Walters, are the downgrading, the rise of stupefactions, the loss of hope, and the 4th element. There's a 4th element that she also speaks about, is the accelerant, but that doesn't exist in ancient Rome. That's like the social media and the internet.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Look, I think we should wrap it up there. It's been an absolutely terrific discussion. I thank you, the 3 of you, very, very warmly. And I know people will appreciate the chance to look at it again as a recording. So let me thank the 3 of you. I also want to have some other thanks, one of which is to our sponsor, Monash University Publishing, a very important publisher that supports this program and provides copies of its books as a very modest way of us saying thank you to our presenters. So thanks to Monash University Publishing. I want to thank the team at Old Treasury, Katie Dunning and Margaret Anderson, who do such a wonderful job with the technology. People from the History Council, Stephanie Holt and Molly McHugh, thank you. And thanks to everybody for your participation and attendance. I think it's been a terrific discussion. And we look forward to our next event in a couple of months on the 19th of November, which will be another really challenging, interesting discussion on challenging Anzac. But thank you very much again to our 3 participants and to all of you for attending. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Thank
you.